was for capturing this road center of Bastogne and others like it, that during the last days of 1944 and the early days of 1945, the so-called Battle for the Bulge was fought. Who would believe nowadays that this small town, at first sight a town like many others, should have been called upon to play so important a role in the history of the world, and that in this region of Belgium and Luxembourg, called the Ardennes, tens of thousands of human lives would be sacrificed for its possession.
The battle for the Bulge was the biggest single-pitched battle of the Western Front. Over 1 million troops took part. It was Hitler's last great desperate gamble. It was one of the most astonishing episodes of the whole Second World War, and also one of the most controversial, for it caused more charges and countercharges than any other event in that war, save Pearl Harbor. It was the crisis that shook the Western Alliance. It was the climax of the Allied invasion of continental Europe. It was the battle where, for all practical purposes, the German fighting spirit was finally broken. It was a story of huffy Prussian generals and of incredible confusion within the Allied ranks. It produced epic struggles, as at Bastogne and Saint-Vite, Elsenborn and Stavelot, Celles and Clairvaux, struggles that will always be writ large in the annals of military history. But it was a time, too, of deep national humiliation, for it contained the biggest mass surrender of American arms of the European war. The beginning of December 1944 had found the Germans on their last legs, or so it seemed to Allied intelligence. Their terrible losses in Normandy, the continual wearing down from the autumn offensives, above all, the relentless bombing of their homeland made German surrender appear imminent. A wave of optimism swept through the Allied ranks, especially among young Americans. Talk was of being home for Christmas, or at the very latest early in the new year. There was even a quiet part of the front where troops were sent for a rest, the Ardennes. For no enemy general in his right mind, argued Allied intelligence, would attempt to attack here. Long famed for its quaint charm, this popular holiday area is crisscrossed with ravines and ridges and gently rolling hills and covered mostly with forests. The roads are sparse and narrow, and generally they follow the rivers. It would appear the worst possible tank country, particularly in winter. Yet twice before, it had been invaded by conquest-hungry German troops bound for the more luxuriant lands of Belgium and France. And as though history could not repeat itself, the American general defending the Ardennes in early December 1944 had only just as many troops as the French general overrun there in May 1940. And what is more, he was facing the selfsame German general, von Rundstedt, whose rapid breakthrough then had led to France's quick collapse and to Britain's near disaster at Dunkirk. The Ardennes was the place where the European war had almost been decided once and for all in 1940. Now, at Hitler's choosing, it was again intended to be the location for a crucial encounter, perhaps the final encounter of the war. But the battle for the Bulge began really much earlier than December 44. In July, in fact, when a bomb wrecked Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the only serious attempt on the German Führer's life in his whole 12 years of power. But because the flimsy building absorbed most of the blast, Hitler escaped with merely minor arm and ear injuries. Even so, he was ordered to bed. Hitherto, the day-to-day conduct of the war had obsessed him, but now he found himself forced to yield such detailed concern to his general staff. But of course, he couldn't give up thinking about the war entirely. And so during August and September, as the Americans and British were racing to the Siegfried Line, and as he lay convalescing, save for the occasional much-publicized visit to the other Wehrmacht officers injured in the plot, he concentrated on how he was to regain the initiative lost since the Normandy landings in June. Although Hitler knew he must attack to stave off inevitable defeat, at first he didn't know where to attack. To strike against Russia seemed pointless, since it would have little effect on that front. Italy presented no obvious prizes, for, as the Allies had found to their cost, it was a country more suited to defense than attack. No, it had to be in the West. But where? By mid-September, the Allied advance was shuddering to a halt along most of the Western Front, as supply lines, already overstretched, finally began to give way. Hitler seized this welcome breathing space to reorganize his armies, sorely battered since D-Day. Moreover, at home, his Gestapo had found little popular support for the attempt on his life. Quite the reverse, the impending invasion of their fatherland rallied the German people behind the Nazis. Most staggering of all to the Allies was the continuing vigor of German industry. Despite the ceaseless bombing, the autumn of 1944 saw German war output reach a new peak, achieved largely by transferring the most vital facilities underground. Hitler's advisors thought an offensive would need at least 25 to 30 divisions. But with 1.25 million soldiers already dead after 5 years of war, and another 3 million wounded, Germany could no longer find that many divisions so easily. They could only come by scouring the manpower barrel for absolutely the final time, by drafting young men barely old enough to fight, and older men who had lasted out the war on the home front, fitting them into new divisions around a corps of regular army personnel, and filling out with ersatz infantrymen, pilots with no planes to fly, ground crews with no engines to service, sailors with no ships to sail, and so on, giving them all weapons and showing them in the shortest possible time how to use them. But the main brunt of the offensive would be borne by a completely new army composed of 4 of the elite SS Panzer divisions, which were to be given absolute priority in men and armor and retrained deep in the heart of Germany. And once a breakthrough had been achieved, Hitler was prepared to strip all other fronts to exploit it. It was to be his supreme gamble. But still, where to attack? Thanks to complete mastery of the air, the Allies had achieved the Normandy breakout with a surprisingly small force. Even by December, they still had only 60 divisions on the continent, fewer than the Germans had. The Germans, too, had managed to deny the advancing Allied troops any new supply harbors other than the Normandy beaches, now 400 miles away. Channel ports like Calais and Boulogne lingered in German hands before being totally destroyed, and Antwerp was not free of mines until late November. And the closer the Allies got to the German border, the lengthier had become their front. Having determined to carry the war to the enemy wherever he was, it soon became obvious to the Allied commander, General Eisenhower, that parts of this long front would have to be held lightly if sufficient forces were to be freed for occasional major attacks elsewhere. So natural barriers were sought out, behind which small groups could defend with scant chance of enemy attack. The notion of the calculated risk was born. In those super-confident days, almost every sector seemed safe from a German counterattack, but because of its hills, its woods, its lack of good roads, above all the apparent scarcity of Germans opposing them, the Ardennes was chosen for the calculated risk. And so the ghost front, the phony front, was created. The 80 miles of the Ardennes were left to just 4 divisions to defend, an average of 20 miles apiece, instead of the 4 or 5 miles recommended in most military manuals. And whenever reserves were needed temporarily elsewhere, as at Arnhem and Antwerp, invariably they were filched from the Ardennes, so that the frontier was stretched still more and more. And once Hitler had spotted this vulnerable sector, as he did in mid-September, he saw to it that its defenders were lulled into an even more false security by keeping the activity opposite them down to an absolute minimum. Like the Allies, he openly used it as a sector for resting worn-out divisions and for initiating new ones. Patrols from both sides passed through the meagerly held lines with impunity, and each reported back the other was weak. And so the American defenders in the Ardennes grew confident and cocky, and in some cases careless, as the days went by with little action along their part of the line.
1 hour after darkness, they went in their quarters to have a dinner where to go to the girls, I don't know, sleeping, and a good breakfast, good razor, and 1 hour before daylight, they came in their positions. And therefore, my opinion was it is possible to penetrate in the very early morning.
Surprise, and hence secrecy, was the keynote of Hitler's plan, particularly since he did not have air superiority. He kept it even from the top Nazi leaders, for after the July plot he'd grown to trust no one, and told merely his closest military confidants, making them swear on oath all the same not to reveal it. His commander-in-chief on the Western Front, von Rundstedt, only heard about the offensive a few weeks before it was due to begin. Either out of pique, or because of his Prussian haughtiness, or because he already believed the war lost, he went out of his way to show his disapproval and left its execution to subordinates. Even to personal briefings by Hitler, he merely sent his chief of staff, General Siegfried Westphal.
We had since September 44 every day asked for reinforcements, for more troops, and we hadn't got only some battalions. On this day, Hitler said us he will send 20 infantry and 10 armored divisions to the Western Front. In the first moment, we were very happy. But then we learned that these troops, the 30 divisions, were not destined for reinforce the defense in the Western Front, but only for attack.
Hitler had his eye on Antwerp, the linchpin of the whole Allied supply system. To capture Antwerp and to reach the Belgian coast would so disrupt the Anglo-American war machine, and with luck entrap some 20 to 30 Allied divisions, that a negotiated peace would not only be possible, but likely to be on his terms. So ran Hitler's logic in that autumn of 1944.
I met Hitler more than 10 times in the last year. Hitler was in these days mentally, spiritually fresh, very fresh, but physically very tired. One of his arms, I think the left arm, and the left leg had signs of paralysis.
Rundstedt and I myself, we had the same attitude as Field Marshal Model, the commander-in-chief of the Army Group B, and his chief of staff, the General Krebs. We had the opinion, we were convinced that 30 division wouldn't be enough to take an offensive in direction to Antwerp. We proposed an alternative to attack the American army around Aachen. In this case, we would have had the possibility to destroy 10 to 15 American divisions, about a quarter of the American expedition forces in Germany. We compared it with Grenzlem, offensive to Antwerp. This plan was to compare with Little Slem in bridge game, and he was absolutely, for my opinion, to realize. Unfortunately, Hitler didn't play bridge, and therefore it was declined.
While his generals huffed and puffed, Hitler, amid the mists of the Schnee-Eifel, the German extension of the Ardennes behind the Siegfried Line, went quietly ahead with assembling his troops, over 500,000 of them to oppose just 80,000 Americans. He realized the Allies were bound to detect some troop movements, and so he ordered the coming offensive to be codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, which made it sound more defensive than offensive. Indeed, to lull the Ardennes defenders still more, he went so far as to create an elaborate deception plan. All the dummy trimmings of a massive defensive army were located near Cologne, so that the Allied reconnaissance planes would report back what the British and American generals expected to hear, namely that Hitler was concentrating his forces to defend the Ruhr, his industrial heartland. In the Eifel itself, every precaution was taken against discovery. The soldiers were issued with charcoal for cooking, so that no smoke would give the game away. Straw was strewn all over the roads to muffle the sound. Movement in any case took place only at night, while aircraft flew up and down the lines to drown out any noise. Over 2,000 troop and supply trains found their way to the Eifel without the Allies noticing. Some intelligence reports did point to a build-up opposite the Ardennes, but they were discounted as ludicrous. Indeed, the one American intelligence officer who persisted in arguing the possibility of a threat there was sent on sick leave to Paris the day before the German offensive began.
Well, the whole philosophy, I think, of the Americans at that time was that we had the Germans on the run and that they didn't have the means to strike back in the fashion which they did.
December the 16th, Null Day arrived, and at precisely 5:30 in the morning, as Hitler had ordered, the German artillery opened up. The barrage lasted 45 minutes and gave the Allies a taste of what they had meted out at Cassino and El Alamein months and years before. The gun flashes lit up the whole of the German line, illuminating for the amazed American defenders massed tanks and half-tracks, and squads upon squads of grey-clad troops. The last great attack of the Germans in the West was on. Hitler's most desperate gamble had begun. The quiet front had suddenly become the noisiest. Surprise was total. As the American soldiers tumbled from their beds into their foxholes, they found them already infiltrated by German infantrymen. It was the beginning of a day of monumental confusion, the worst the Allies experienced in the whole of the European war. Even as the first German waves were overrunning the American positions along the Ardennes, talk at Allied headquarters in Versailles that morning was more of the news that band leader Glenn Miller's plane had gone missing over the Channel than of the possibility of the greatest German offensive in the West since 1940. It was the day Eisenhower received official word of his promotion to 5-star general, and a letter in the post from Field Marshal Montgomery requesting leave to go home to England for Christmas. Ike was, in fact, attending his chauffeur's wedding, while further north, Montgomery was playing golf with the famous Welsh professional Di Rees. As the day wore on, the uncanny resemblance to the German breakthrough in the Ardennes in 1940 grew. Their overwhelming might, their relentless, ruthless speed, above all, the chaos in the Allied rear, as bewildered, dazed, untried troops dashed for safety and clogged the roads.
What should have been 4 or 5 hours road march wound up being 12, 14, maybe even 16 hours. Consequently, instead of getting there in daylight hours and getting our position set up, it was pitch dark when we arrived, and we sort of had to feel our way along. It was amazing that we had to almost force our own units to give us road space so that we could get up and fight.
For a period of at least 36 or 48 hours, the road to Brussels was in fact open, with nothing to stop them. The bridge at Namur was intact and indeed not at this stage prepared even for demolition. And around the 18th, 19th, until the night of the 19th, that road was open, and I, at least in theory, see no reason why German armored cars could not have got through to Brussels.
Communications were broken with division headquarters on the second day, and it was at that time my regimental commander, under apparently the last orders he received, turned the regiment around 180 degrees and attacked to the rear. About noon, we were approaching a village called Schoenberg on the main supply route. This we attacked down a long wooded slope, medium forest, to find that, in fact, the road and town were heavily occupied by German troops, to include some German anti-aircraft units. And it was those anti-aircraft guns that finally broke up our attack. Well, it was late afternoon of the 19th that what was left of the regiment, my regimental commander surrendered. And it was at that time I was picked up and became a prisoner of war.
7,000 American troops surrendered in one go. The biggest mass surrender of American arms in the European war. And second in American military history, only to that at Bataan in the Pacific. The German newsreel cameramen had a field day, taking care to emphasize, of course, under Goebbels' racialist direction, the finer facial differences between the German Aryan stock and the American Negroid.
Fahrzeuge, Nachschub, Trosse auf der einen Seite und Dreierkolonnen marschierender weißer und schwarzer Amerikaner auf der anderen Seite.
To these men, the war certainly was to be over by Christmas, though clearly not in the way they had joked just days before. But as well as the humiliation and the hysteria, there turned out to be another resemblance to 1940. Then, with the German panzers full pelt for the Channel ports, Churchill had called upon the French commander, General Gamelin, to summon forth his strategic reserve. But Gamelin had told him there was none. This had seemed the ultimate in military incompetence, the supreme evocation of the so-called Maginot Line complex. Now, 4 years later, Eisenhower, because of his broad front policy, was in a dangerously similar situation. He had no strategic reserve as such, merely 1 or 2 airborne and armored divisions going spare, recuperating after their mauling at Arnhem, or else readying themselves for the coming crossing of the Rhine. Not all the confusion during those early days was of the Allies' own making, though. Much of it was planned by Hitler as an essential ingredient in his strategy. German commandos, dressed in American uniforms, under the direction of Otto Skorzeny, the daring rescuer of Mussolini, were sent ahead of the panzers to capture bridges over the Meuse, to sabotage Allied communications, to spread rumors even of a possible assassination attempt on Eisenhower's life, above all, by their very presence to create alarm and fear in the American rear.
Roadblocks were established and everybody was questioned. Typical questions were who pitched for the Yankees in such and such a year. And unless you could answer, you were detained.
Only a mere 40 or so of Skorzeny's 150 commandos successfully infiltrated the Allied lines. And of these, all but 8 returned. 3 of the 8 captured, however, were court-martialed for wearing American uniforms and were later shot by the Allies.
The paratroops, too, were somewhat of a bad morale factor because the troops had seen the parachutes hanging in the trees, and they knew that there were paratroops in the area.
It was a stormy night, and with snow and very dark, and it was rather difficult to gather together. Eventually, after an hour, I had only 35 men with me, and we had been lying in a ditch near the road, near the crossroad I had to open for these ass tanks. And on this road, an American unit came on tracks. Some of the American soldiers slept and others saw us and waved to us, and we waved back.
Like Skorzeny's commandos, the psychological impact of Baron von der Heiter's parachutists proved far more important than their operational effect. For days after the drop, American soldiers everywhere were reporting sightings of German parachutists who really were not there.
And every morning, for instance, we got the orders that the American Army Corps sent to the divisions. And we made, every day we made some prisoners, about 100 or 200 of them, and in the evening we sent them home.
The Allies didn't realize straight away the extent of the offensive. Just a local diversion, one frontline commander reported back to base that first day. But as well as surprise, speed was the essence of Hitler's plan too. Nothing was to delay the panzers in their dash for Antwerp. They were to bypass all strongly held positions that couldn't be taken by their initial onslaughts. But one town they could not afford to bypass was Saint-Vith, just 9 miles from their starting point.
Saint-Vith, while a small village, was a very important road center. 7 roads came into this tiny village, and 2 railroads, one of which came from Germany and one of which ran north and south along the front. It was the only railhead available to Manteuffel, and it was essential to his forces that he capture the city.
Well, at 2:30 in the afternoon of the 17th, I took command of the sector. I immediately established a roadblock on the road coming from the east towards St. Vith. And as my troops arrived on starting at about 4:30 in the afternoon, I reinforced that roadblock and set up a defensive horseshoe, but my mobile troops, my tanks, I kept in reserve for counterattack purposes. And my tactics for the next week was to roll with the punches.
The Germans would make their attacks normally twice a day, in morning and afternoon, almost like clockwork. And we would literally stack the bodies up like cordwood when they came within range. I remember specifically one machine gun position, for example, where I assisted in removing the dead German bodies from in front of that gun so we could continue to fire. They were 4 and 5 deep in many places.
We had successfully held up Manteuffel for 6 days in a time when time was critical to him. Time was not critical to me. I wasn't going anywhere. He was trying to go somewheres, and he had to go fast.
But the actual withdrawal, talking to the few survivors that lasted, was one of almost terror, you might say. It was dark. We had run out of almost all heavy caliber of ammunition, anti-tank guns. We knew we couldn't withstand any additional attacks. And we pulled out pretty much pell-mell. And at the time we pulled out, we were getting shot at from, we thought at the time, the civilians in St. Vith. And we were pretty bitter about that because we had been trying to protect the village from the Germans.
In the bitter fighting for Saint-Vith, before it finally fell on December the 21st, Hitler's hopes for an early dash to Antwerp took a decided dip. Meanwhile, some 8 miles to the north of Saint-Vith, an SS Panzer unit had been desperately seeking a breakout of the Ardennes. Thwarted by the determined resistance of the American defenders of the Elsenborn Ridge, their searching for an opening along its southern slopes had brought them to a crossroads near Malmedy, where they perpetrated the most infamous atrocity of the Battle of the Bulge, and one of the worst of the whole European war. 2 civilians witnessed the so-called Malmedy massacre. One, a woman, disappeared that same day and has never been heard of since. The other, Henri Le Joly, still lives at the crossroads as he has always done, and where there now stands a memorial to the murdered men.
C'était dimanche dans l'offensive von Unstedt. Je me trouvais ici dans le café.
It was a Sunday afternoon, the day after the German offensive began. I was here in the cafe at the crossroads, just beside my house, talking to the lady who owned it. Suddenly, we saw a line of American jeeps stop at the crossroads, and they came into the cafe to ask the way to Saint-Vith. Just as suddenly as they came in, they dashed out again and went round to the back of the cafe. For coming from the opposite direction, we could see a long line of German tanks. The Germans began firing at the Americans. There was a lot of firing, and we hid. Then the firing stopped, and we came out. The Americans had all been captured and were being led into the field by the side of the cafe. They appeared unconcerned with life. Then suddenly a shot rang out, and another, more rapidly, and we could see that the Germans had machine-gunned the lot of them. Though a few, I believe, did manage to crawl away to safety.
The bodies of the 84 murdered Americans were discovered later that same day, and word of the massacre quickly spread throughout the Allied commands. Surrender to American personnel was now a riskier business for any German, particularly for any member of the SS. Nor were the SS atrocities in the Battle for the Bulge limited to this Malmedy incident. According to the official US Army history, within the first 4 days of the offensive, this same SS Panzer unit murdered over 300 American prisoners in cold blood and at least 100 unarmed Belgian civilians. After the war, some 73 members of this SS unit were convicted of these crimes, and nearly all sentenced to death or lifelong imprisonment. But in the end, because of legal technicalities, most of the sentences were commuted, including that of the unit's leader, Jochen Peiper, who today lives quietly in southern Germany. Hitler had banked on a slow reaction from the Allies. He firmly believed it would be many days before Eisenhower would realize the size of the attack. He was convinced, too, that Eisenhower would not be able to halt his own planned offensives and regroup his forces to counterattack without first consulting Roosevelt and Churchill. By that time, he expected to be in Antwerp. But he'd misjudged the unity of the Allied command, and in particular, the confidence Roosevelt and Churchill had in Eisenhower. Despite the unbelievable chaos, Eisenhower, even by the evening of the first day, was pushing reinforcements into the Ardennes as fast as he could. He also made another decision at this time, much more controversial. Hitherto, the Ardennes had been exclusively an American area, but now he decided to give the responsibility for the northern half, the US First Army, to the British commander, Field Marshal Montgomery. Eisenhower argued that the German offensive was aimed at strategic objectives within Montgomery's zone of command, and moreover, that the German breakthrough had cut the communications of the American forces in this northern half, with their headquarters in Luxembourg City to the south. Even so, there were many Americans who never forgave Ike for this decision, which to them seemed a further American humiliation. To Montgomery, though, it came as a great challenge.
Along about the 20th of December, when the 8th Corps moved far to the west, I was feeling very lonely. Only Germans to the south of me, to the east of me, to the west of me, and to the north of me. I sent a liaison officer of my own to the First Army to tell them where I was. Of course, we didn't know where First Army was, but we had an idea it must be near Liège, and this man found it and reported. Fortunately, Marshal Montgomery was at First Army when this officer arrived, and the next day, a liaison officer from Montgomery arrived at my headquarters. At last, I felt as though we belonged to someone.
To the average American, the name Bastogne, more than any other, epitomizes the Battle for the Bulge. The heroic defense of this little market town was perhaps the most dashing episode in the whole battle. Certainly more has been written of it than any other. Just as Saint-Vith was the hub of the northern road and rail network in the Ardennes, so Bastogne was its southern hub. 7 roads came into it and 3 railways. It was important to the German advance, though maybe not as vital as Saint-Vith, since, unlike Saint-Vith, it could be bypassed. Indeed, Hitler had ordered it to be bypassed, which is what his main panzers did, leaving the mopping up of its defenders to the infantry following. But unbeknownst to Hitler's generals, Eisenhower had sent an airborne division to hold Bastogne, and they were determined not to give it up without a struggle. The last remark made to the airborne division commander, General McAuliffe, by his immediate boss was, "Now don't get yourself surrounded," which is precisely what happened. The Germans completed their encirclement on December the 21st, the day Saint-Vith fell, and the next morning they issued McAuliffe with an ultimatum to surrender, to which he impishly replied, "Nuts," a remark that was to go into military folklore. But it was the day, too, that the first heavy snow of winter began to blanket the Ardennes, and as often happens with such a change of weather, the fog lifted. The very next day, the Allied fighter bombers were able to fly for the first time in the offensive and to harass the besieging Germans, not just around Bastogne, but everywhere in the Ardennes. Hitler's luck had finally run out. What was even better for the beleaguered soldiers in Bastogne was that the good flying weather allowed them to be resupplied from the air. During the next 3 days, nearly 1,000 planes and gliders made the trip to Bastogne to drop much-needed food, fuel, ammunition and medicines. On Christmas Eve alone, over 100 tons of supplies plummeted from the skies around Bastogne. The best Christmas present the battered bastards of Bastogne, as they like to call themselves, were ever likely to have. The day after Christmas, the siege was relieved, when an advance column from General Patton's army broke through from the south. Even so, the heaviest casualties and the bitterest fighting were still to come for the defenders of Bastogne, as Hitler in his despair unleashed the fury of his panzers against the town. Even the Luftwaffe put in an appearance above the Ardennes, positively its last significant appearance of the war. As at Saint-Vite, the defenders of Bastogne carved a niche for themselves in the annals of American military history. Amid uncertainty, they maintained their ground. Amid defeat and monumental confusion elsewhere, they proved a firm, reliable rock in a German flood. Theirs was an epic contribution, one not lightly forgotten.
It was the day before Christmas. I saw that I couldn't fight anymore. We had no ammunition and no food and nothing. And so I gave order to my soldiers to form groups of 2 or 3 men and to try to reach the German lines. And so did I. And in Monschau, I tried to find a house, a German house, just to have a rest for a few hours, and I found it. But in the morning I was so at the end of my forces that I wrote a letter to the American commanding officer telling them that I surrender. And the funny thing was, he came, a lot of American soldiers to bring me to the American headquarters, and at the American headquarters, an officer came and asked me if I wished to confess, and I said, my goodness, I thought, my goodness, now at the end I shall be shot or something like this. But it was only an American chaplain, and because it was Christmas night, he asked me if I wished to confess and to get the communion.
During the first week or so of the offensive, the Germans managed to penetrate the American lines in the Ardennes to a depth of some 50 miles, and so form the Bulge, which has given the battle its popular name. But the Bulge was finally nipped at the little village of Celle, just 4 miles short of the river Meuse, the Germans' primary objective on their way to Antwerp and the Belgian coast. Here, von Manteuffel's panzers were mortally mauled by the US 2nd Armored Division with the help of the British Household Cavalry in the decisive encounter of the campaign. The German tanks had run out of petrol, and motionless were sitting ducks, not just for the Allied guns on the ground, but for the Allied planes too. It was a great slaughter, the American divisional commander wrote in his report. More than 400 German tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed in the 3-day battle over Christmas, and nearly 100 heavy guns. 2,500 Germans were killed or wounded, and 1,200 taken prisoner. For Hitler, it was more than the beginning of the end. The weather worsened, and the bitter slugging match to liquidate the Bulge went on in some of the most appalling conditions the Allies were ever called upon to fight in. Yet just when total victory in the battle seemed theirs for the taking, the Allies chose to fall out among themselves, or at least the top 2 generals almost did.
There was a difference of opinion between Montgomery and Eisenhower as to the future strategy of the war, and also Monty was very keen that a land force commander should be, or ground force commander, land force commander should be appointed under Eisenhower. Eisenhower did not agree with this idea. And this was a sort of smouldering problem that went on and was obviously causing friction. I think it was on the 28th of December that Eisenhower decided to visit Montgomery at his headquarters to discuss the future of operations. And the day afterwards, Montgomery sent Eisenhower a letter expressing his views as to the importance of appointing a land force commander. Well, of course, directly I saw this letter, I realized that this has really upset Eisenhower, knowing his views. And so I got on the phone to Beadle Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and asked him what the form was. And I realized immediately that a real crisis has arisen. And so I then flew to Schaeff in order to see what I could do about it. I arrived on a particular evening and saw Beadle Smith, who took me along to see Eisenhower at a little office he was using in the Versailles grounds. And in the room was seated Tedder, who was a Deputy Supreme Commander, and Eisenhower's military assistant. And they were vetting a signal which was going to be sent to Washington. Now, apparently, Eisenhower had received that very day a signal from Marshall, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, expressing complete confidence in Eisenhower himself and telling him to resist any pressures that were coming from Montgomery to appoint a land force commander. And they were vetting a reply to this signal. And I told Eisenhower that I thought some real trouble was afoot, and could I do anything to put things right? And after some difficulty, Tedder rather objecting at first, Eisenhower showed me this signal. When I read it, I nearly fell off my chair. It was an absolutely disastrous thing. Eisenhower in the signal said that a time had come when either Montgomery or himself must go. However, I said, please give me 24 hours. So I'm sure I can put this right. I'm sure my chief doesn't appreciate the situation, and I'm sure when it's explained to him, you will have complete cooperation. Well, after considerable discussion, Eisenhower agreed that I should have 24 hours. And so the next morning I flew off to our part of the front, and I arrived at Montgomery's battle headquarters at tea time. And I arrived just as they were having tea, and I'd already sent a signal to Montgomery saying that I had to see him very urgently that evening. When I got in, he said, "What are you doing here, Freddie? What's the problem?" I said, "You'll hear about it, sure enough." So he said, "Have your tea and then come up and see me in my office." So I went up and I told him exactly what had happened. At first he was completely nonplussed. He couldn't believe that such a signal had been or was going to be sent. And he asked me, he said, if I go, who could they put in my place? And I said, well, the suggestion was Alexander. When he heard this, he was in a very depressed state, and he asked what he should do. So we discussed the matter, and then he sent a signal to Eisenhower saying that he'd seen me, and he was very upset that Eisenhower should have been put in this position, that he would, of course, loyally support him in anything he decided, and he hoped that things would go well from now onwards. Well, that signal was immediately sent off. I then, later that night, drove back to Brussels, our main headquarters, and rang up Beadle Smith, and I found that the signal had arrived, that Eisenhower was delighted.
But the squabbling at the top had not stopped the fighting down below. With the German attack in the Ardennes at a complete standstill after Christmas, the Americans and the British pressed down on them from the north, while General Patton's army thrust up from the south. They met in mid-January, by which time the German army was in total disarray, for the Russians had opened their winter offensive 4 days before. Now Hitler's attack in the Ardennes was seen to be not just a desperate gamble, but supreme folly. For in order to mount his offensive in the west, he'd had to completely denude his defense in the east. With its last carefully hoarded reserves of fuel and equipment, and of course of men too, gone, the German war machine collapsed rapidly. 20,000 Germans were trapped when the neck of the Bulge was nipped out by the Allied link-up at Houffalize on January the 16th, 1945. Thereafter, the battle for the Bulge, and indeed the whole European war, was merely a mop-up. That the fighting spirit of the German soldier had finally been broken showed in the faces of the men taken prisoner. Few who survived the retreat from the Ardennes now believed there was the slightest chance of Germany winning.
My mood in the following weeks and months till now, 1969, I was very, very disheartened that the commanders and all men, and myself too, had been deceived by Hitler. Therefore, I was not astonished that after the Allies gained the supremacy of the air and all our movements by daylight came to a standstill, a total breakdown of all men, all officers happened.
Indeed, within 3 months of the Battle for the Bulge ending, Hitler's Third Reich had surrendered and the German Führer lay dead in his Berlin bunker. His last throw in the Ardennes cost nearly 200,000 Allied and German casualties. The Americans alone suffered as many as both sides had at the Battle of Gettysburg. That it shortened the war, there can be little doubt. A potential Allied humiliation was turned into the victory that finally put paid to the might of Hitler's panzers and to the myth of Hitler's personal mystique.
Thanking you for your attention. I hope before you leave our town that you will not forget the crew of the tank and all those like them who gave their lives in the battle for the Bulge.